There is something special in the forest of our great and vast country. There is a special atmosphere that captures a person like a whirlpool. Almost everyone wants to spend as much time as possible in solitude with the wild, with the rustle of leaves and light wind, with the smell of a nearby murmuring mountain river, a warm bonfire lined with stones, and a delicious dinner under the starry, boundless sky. I was one of those people. Nothing pleases me so much as going to the forest and spending the night there. It was the only thing I used to dream about, often, especially on weekends, in order to take a break from the hard-working week. I packed my huge backpack and went for a walk in the forest. So it was until one story that happened to me, which I'm going to tell you later. I will start with the fact that I live far from the capital. I won't name a specific town. I will only say that it is located in the northern part of the country, namely, not far from Canada. I think this area needs no introduction because everybody knows its untouched nature, clean air, and indescribably beautiful landscapes that you can look at for hours without taking your eyes off. The following events took place exactly in that area. I was still very young then, and spent all my life in the local forest. My father was a passionate hunter. My grandfather was also engaged in the trade of furs and other goods that wild nature could bestow on a man. Of course, they cultivated in me a love for nature. But I wasn't a very good hunter. I liked animals and refused to shoot them outright, even when my father dragged me along on a hunt. Noticing the animal, in a harsh voice, ordered me to shoot it down. I just handed him the gun back. I even couldn't watch him shoot any living creature. But still, despite my whining, they always allowed me to go with them, and I never refused. I was too young, so nobody allowed me to go by myself. It was very easy to get lost there, and only God knew what kind of animal I could meet. The story that I mentioned a little earlier happened only a year ago, and from that day on, everything that I loved so much became alien to me, terrible and unbearable. Everything changed that day. The forest no longer seemed to be a harmless place, with wild animals, tall trees, and clearings with lots of wild berries on them. Now it looks to me like a terrible swamp, overgrown with thick moss. It's turned into a place I would never like to go, or even approach to, on that sunny and surprisingly warm day. I was going on a hike. It was the first day off after a hard week shift, and since I didn't have anywhere to go the next day, I could afford to spend the night in the woods. Sometimes I even could spend a few nights in the wild. I had everything I needed for this: water, food, a tent, a sleeping bag, and other tourist equipment that I'm able to list for a very long time. I put everything in my backpack yesterday in the evening when I came home from work. I decided to go light and take only the most necessary things, not as I usually do, dragging a whole damn tent city behind me. And this happened to me more than once. But you know I live by the principle it is better to have, but not to need, than to need and not to have. Once I went on a similar trip and forgot the flint, so I had to make a fire as the cave people did. Once I went on a similar trip and forgot the flint. This time, having prepared everything in the evening and double-checked it in the morning, I set off without even having breakfast. Today I plan to go on a completely new and unexplored route. Before I continue, I want to note that this is a common thing for me. I have never come to the same place twice, since I am good at navigating in the forest, and I always have a compass with me. Of course, I could get lost, and this happened more than once, but I didn't wander for long and soon came out where I needed to go. Soon on that day, my journey began with the bus station. I bought a ticket to a random village and went on the road. The bus was half empty. and it was going comfortably. The sun had already risen and was shining brightly, so when I sometimes looked out the window, the tears began to flow because of the light. Of course, the weather was great, but I'm much more fond of overcast. It creates a special atmosphere or something. I have been riding for about an hour and, having written down the name of the village from the road sign, asked the driver to stop. I found myself in the middle of a long road. It was totally silent all around, so feeling only a slight breeze from the bus that had just left, I headed towards the forest, which actually completely surrounded the local village. Having marked it on the map, and just in case in the navigator, I stepped into the darkness of the forest. You never know what can happen, so it is better to be careful. This area is extremely remote, and there is no hope for anyone but yourself here. In the forest, I didn't find a single path. No human had been there. It was invisible to the untamed eye, and it made me feel happy. The first thing to do was to find a suitable place to camp, and then to make some food, because while I was riding the bus, my stomach began to express its displeasure. This had never happened before, but it took more and more time to find a suitable place with each step I took. There wasn't a single clearing on the way, even the smallest one, but I kept going. Sometimes even had to squeeze through the trees, so dense was the forest. But still, by the afternoon, fortune had smiled on me. I had stopped for some snacks in order to restore at least a little energy when I noticed a small clearing on my left. That place could barely be called a clearing, rather just a place without trees. And not far away from that place, I could hear a stream gurgling. Its sound was clearly audible in the local silence. It was a perfect place to make a camp. First of all, of course, I made a fire to warm up a little, and to scare off the local animals if, God forbid, they would decide to come. You can easily write a whole encyclopedia about local animals, so it's better to be very attentive. The campfire gave me some confidence, so I set up a tent next to it and began to make lunch. A hot stew with meat and mushrooms was exactly what I needed. By the way, I collected some mushrooms on the way here. My body and mind were totally relaxed. After having lunch, I was lying on a sleeping bag and admiring the fire and the clouds exactly until it began to get dark. In the evening, the forest turned into something special. I hope many of you will understand what I'm talking about. Maybe it's our brain that perceives it in a way and draws in the mind some unrealistic images. Or, really, as soon as it starts to get dark, strange and inexplicable things happen in the forest, as those that happened to me that evening. I was sitting quietly and sipping hot tea from an aluminum mug. It was still silent all around me when I heard the same sipping sound, only it seemed that it was about 10 meters away from me. At first, I didn't even pay attention to it, just thinking that it seemed to me. But after taking a second sip, I really noticed that the sound I emitted was repeated, with a slight delay of 3 to 4 seconds. No, it was a dense, overgrown area, and there could be no echo. It was a specific sound, neither moving away nor approaching. I tried to explain to myself that it was just a trick of my imagination, but still, when I didn't succeed, I turned on my flashlight and shone it in the direction from which I thought the sound was carried. But there were only trees, bushes, and nothing more. Without removing the beam of the flashlight, I took another sip, and the sound was repeated one more time a few seconds later, just from the side where I was shining. I thought I was overheated in the sun, but no, it wasn't so hot today, and I've been in the shade all this time. With such thoughts, I even didn't notice that the darkness covered the forest. The fire was getting smaller and smaller, and more wood had to be added. The ones prepared earlier during the day burned out surprisingly quick, and I had to get up and leave my camp in search of fuel. I walked constantly, looking back at the still burning fire that, God forbid, not to get lost. In such a dark place, it was easy to do this, The yellow light was moving further and further away from me every second, and once again I turned around and walked into a tree, hitting my forehead suddenly. I opened my eyes and understood that it wasn't a tree, or rather, it was a tree. But firstly, it was no longer alive, and secondly, it was more like a pillar, from which several hundred years ago someone tried to carve something like a statue. Overgrown with moss and eaten by insects, it stood in the middle of the forest. I touched it, trying to understand what kind of pillar it was, as I had no doubt that it had been made by a human. And after peeling the interesting thing that it was, and after peeling the moss, I noticed that, indeed, the pillar looked like a thin human figure. And the most interesting thing is that it wasn't brought here, and wasn't inserted into the ground. It was specifically carved in a dry tree, the roots of which probably went far underground, so someone definitely was here a very long time ago. But a strange, sticky, nasty feeling of anxiety came to me later, namely when I realized that those repeated sipping sounds came from here. That's weird. It's a hell of a thing. After a few steps back on the mysterious pillar, I walked back to camp, and the further I moved away from this pillar, the better it made me feel. That terrible feeling became less pronounced, and when I got closer to the fire, it was gone. It was getting colder by the minute, and after warming up a little and having a snack, I decided to get into the tent, wrap myself in the sleeping bag, and fall asleep. So I did, first throwing some large logs found on the way back to the fire. In the tent, however, it was extremely cozy and nice, and without thinking about anything, I fell asleep. I have a very light sleep. That is why, in the middle of the night, I opened my eyes. It was so cold that a sleeping bag and thermal underwear couldn't warm me up. It was dark around the tent, and the fire wasn't burning, and apparently, it wasn't even smoking, which was very strange. Furthermore, that unpleasant feeling returned, and not in vain. Otherwise, how to explain the fact I got out of the tent and saw the same pillar right in front of me? There wasn't a trace of drowsiness left, as if I hadn't been sleeping a moment ago. There was no way he could get up here, I thought, scratching my head with a trembling hand and staring at the pillar. No, this is too much, I said aloud and began to pack up my things as quickly as possible. I didn't have the slightest desire to stay there. The darkness was incredible, and the fire wasn't even smoldering, and it didn't even radiate the slightest warmth, as if it wasn't burning at all. Having packed my things, I hurried back to where I had come from. I had roughly memorized the path to the village. It must be some kind of phenomenon. I was indignant, stumbling over the ground and the roots of the trees protruding from it. How did it end up in the middle of my camp? Just how can it be? That's impossible, isn't it? I saw that it was right in the ground. Does it mean that someone pulled out a dry tree and transported it right next to the tent? I don't understand anything, and I don't even want to. Then I felt an incredible desire to get out of the forest as soon as possible. I felt very uncomfortable in it, and there was an impression that something horrible would happen, and I wasn't ready for it. I walked through the forest for a long time. It seemed even longer than during the day. I took a glance at my left and noticed a hut there, a very old one. It seemed to be abandoned for 50 or maybe even 100 years. It was a common hunting hut. I had no desire to go there. I wasn't the character of a horror film who explores absolutely everything. Perhaps, if it wasn't for the pillar that suddenly appeared in my camp, I would have come in and looked at what was there. But after that creepy thing in my camp, I definitely wasn't going to do that. However, the hut that suddenly appeared in my path was clear evidence that I was lost. Trying not to panic, I took out the navigator and tried to understand where I was. It seems that everything is correct. I have already passed here, but there was no hut. I noticed it even in the dark, so I would definitely see it during the day. Only after taking out a compass and a map and checking everything, I was once again convinced that something extremely strange was happening, and that it was better not to walk but to run as fast as possible. The compass needle turned in different directions, unable to point anywhere, and as for the map, apparently I was in an absolutely different place from where the navigator showed me, but the worst was yet to come. As I stared at the map in disbelief, using the flashlight to light it up, a strange sound suddenly reached my ears. The noise made by the paper map was repeated in a few seconds. A distinctive rustle echoed in the distance, just like the sips of tea. I looked up and stared at the hut, which was overgrown with bushes and stood even closer to me than when I first saw it. It may seem okay, but I didn't move a single step. I still keep myself together, even though I was on the verge of a panic attack. My experience told me that if I snapped and ran away, I would make it even worse. It was necessary to get to know where I was and choose the shortest path to escape. There was some strange anomaly in that place. At that moment, I thought that everything can be explained, but what happened next is just impossible to explain. A few minutes later, when I found the way out of the forest, I again heard repeated sounds. It seemed to be my footsteps, but this time the sounds were emitted right next to me, and only turning my head for a moment, I saw someone running after me. It was pitch dark in the woods, and the flashlight shone only forward so that I wouldn't hit my face right against another pillar. And then I saw something running. It was moving on all fours like a bent human. I thought for a moment what kind of animal had followed me. I would have been glad if it was some kind of wolf or bear. A humanoid creature, snarling and baring its teeth, was stretching its mouth as no human could do. It was drooling and making noises that made me stumble and fall in incredible animal terror. The monster had a gray-green body, which seemed to be covered with tan leather and sewn with thin willow branches, a small head with a large mouth, which took up half of the head, and dragged hideously along the ground after the creature, as if its jaw had been knocked out. I quickened my pace as fast as I could, shining the flashlight ahead of me, and only for a split second, raising my head, I saw an even more terrible scene. A dozen of other creatures, which looked like my terrible pursuer, were perched on the branches of the pines. Most of them, oddly enough, hung from the branches, as people hang on crossbars, making the sounds I've heard before. Being distracted by that terrible view, I tripped over something and fell to the ground, and after that, God forbid you ever see such a thing. They went nuts. Each of them began to jump on the branches as if they were happy that I had fallen. They opened their mouths, and in an instant, all of them began to climb down the trees. Their eyes reflected the light of the flashlight, creating the effect of a poor quality photo, which made them look even more terrible. I ran for some more time. I remember that I didn't run for long, at most 5 minutes. Then I took out a flare gun, and on the move, I fired into the air. The red star soared up, illuminating everything that was happening around me. It was only then that I noticed that there was even more of them than I thought at first. Almost half of those creatures were hiding in the dark, but now I managed to see them. There was definitely one more positive point. As soon as I launched the flare, they all calmed down. They lost the desire to attack me or to even climb down from the branches. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, and took out another flare gun. And just as I was ready to shoot, I saw a huge brownish green spot on my arm. It covered half of my palm. It definitely wasn't dirt or clay. Something had happened to my hand. It was when I saw the spot that I gave vent to my emotions. I screamed like a madman. Screamed because of the pain that suddenly spread from this spot all over my body. Holding my hand, I screamed so loudly that my voice echoed even in such a dense forest. I was willing to do anything to make this sudden pain disappear, but after a couple of seconds, the unthinkable horror happened. I found the pillar one more time. The same pillar was standing about 10 feet away from me. It was definitely the same one, not any other, and literally, as soon as I noticed it, one of my pursuers ran towards me. I was ready to meet my ancestors when a strange creature took my hand and, with a neat movement, tore off a strange growth from my palm. The skin was regenerated immediately, as if it formed just out of the air, and the pain was gone, as abruptly as it appeared. After that, the creature turned around and made an incredibly eerie sound that called his friends to him. Then I was already sitting and getting ready to die, but they gathered around a pillar and began to knock it down in every possible way. They were shaking and beating it, and in the end, they managed to do it. The pillar fell to the ground with a nasty crack, and those creatures, as if rejoicing, jumped up into the trees and disappeared into the darkness. After that, I lay in shock for some time, and finally took out the compass, which showed me the right direction. Only in the morning, I came out of the forest, just on the right path that I had been trampled down the previous day. I caught a bus there and went home. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find any information about that place on the internet. There were only similar articles about hermits, or even whole tribes of people who believed and worshipped some of their carved wood gods, right not so far from that village. Maybe it's somehow connected. I don't know. In 2 weeks, I decided to go to that village and ask the locals if anyone knows about the mysterious place that I happened to visit. Only one man, strangely waving me off, said that I met the hangers. Then I asked if he knew something about them. He accurately described those with whom I managed to meet, and said that they were called hangers because they constantly hang on trees and climb down only in rare cases. What's more, only the one who has suffered from the spirit trapped in wooden pillars can see them. What spirit? Why was it trapped? No one gave me an answer.